Earth, we have incarnations in those time cycles. It's a different time matrix, literally, that interfaces with our own, that creates the inner Earth time cycles. There are selves of us there. They're the ones that are sending the information to us here to help us to get out of this predicament, because if we get stuck, they get stuck. So there's this huge support system. We can get scared sometimes if we look around and think, God, we're all alone with this, and we're just learning this knowledge, and it's a tiny little group, and there's a whole bunch of groups that are not going to want to deal with this stuff, particularly if they're dealing with anybody on that list that I had up first. If you start to realize that you're not alone here and you never were, it's really helpful because you have a support team with you. They're in other time frames, but times aren't far away. They're actually taking place in the same space. The only thing making you separate from your other time selves is the axis on which your particles are rotating. That is it. All right, angular rotation of particle spin allows multiple different reality fields and matter fields to take place in exactly the same space, but be imperceivable and invisible to each other, where they literally pass through each other. So your selves are very close, and it can help to know that. It can help to draw on that. Or if you realize that you're here as part of a team, what would look like a team? If you got all of yourselves into this time continuum, you'd have quite the party. You'd have at least 1,728, and possibly 4 times that, and that would just be you. Interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I remember, but my first thought was, oh God, I wouldn't want to have to figure out what to wear in the morning. It's hard enough with one body. All right. So now, okay, I'm going to go into, this is the stuff that, this is the stuff, when I saw how this unfolded, I just kind of shook my head and said, oh Lordy. Well,
I'm going to try another shot.
Yeah, we can give that a shot. Yeah. Okay. The recent timeline of events from 1916 to 2001. I'm going to go through some of it fast, because if I go through this as slowly as I did the first part, we'll be here until probably next Friday. All right. 1916, the Zetas. That's the Zeta Regalian races. They're the ones that have the Zeta Draconian agenda. All right. The Zeta races of Phantom Earth opened the Atlantean Falcon wormhole. All right. We had the Falcon wormhole and the Phoenix wormhole. All right. They opened the Falcon wormhole off the eastern coast of South Carolina, and it's right down there, like close to the border of Florida, and then the Phoenix is right below that, like across from out on the coast of like St. Augustine, Jacksonville, that area of Florida. Okay, so they opened the wormhole. That was both of these wormholes were located in Lower Nohasa, Atlantis.
How did they do that? How did they open it?
Sonics from their side. Okay. And they've been trying to do it for a long time. It took them a long time to get through the cap, the frequency cap that the Guardians had put on it. Excuse me a minute, it's getting hot. Here we go again. You can feel the energy coming in. This is where I was drooping before and I was tired while we were having dinner. Now I'm getting the energy coming back in. I can feel it. I'll probably start talking fast. If I don't, we're not going to get out of here in time. Okay. All right. They came in and they began speculating for invasion. Now this is a situation where they came in to our time frame. The Anunnaki had been dominating everything here since Atlantis. The Anunnaki are the ones who orchestrated the fall of Atlantis. They're the ones, they had the Nibiru Diotic crystal grid already operational here. They had the net operational here. They had control over most of the Illuminati hybrid races here. So it was Anunnaki dominated predominantly for most of the time from Atlantis all the way through. There were always these competing groups of fallen angelic races that were trying to get in to work with their Illuminati, where you had the Draconian races coming up and competing with them, and some of the Centaur races coming up, through their Illuminati races here competing. That's why we had a huge history of fighting since the Atlantean period, because you had these various different Illuminati groups that were taking over human tribes, and then they were fighting with each other because they represented different fallen angelics. But when we entered this century, the Anunnaki races figured they had it aced. All right, they 100 years before the year 2000, they had it aced. They were in control of most of the Illuminati races. They had the territories mostly under their control, as far as gate territories and all that kind of stuff. So they figured they were just going to run their little agenda and come in here as our space brothers and get it all done nice and neat, and just get rid of the other, the competitors. Well, they had quite a surprise. In 1916, the Zetas from Phantom Earth managed to break through the wall in time and started to invade here. And what they did was they made treaties with certain members of the the Illuminati races. Now remember, the Illuminati were pretty much controlled already through mystical schools that had come up literally from Atlantis. They were controlled by Anunnaki. All of a sudden you have these little gray guys coming in and saying, hey, you're being positioned for an invasion. These Anunnaki races are trying to come in here and invade you. Talk about pot calling the kettle black. I mean, yeah. So the Illuminati were like, oh, they're trying to invade, aren't they? The Zetas convinced the Illuminati that the Anunnaki were trying to invade, which was true. They forgot to tell them that they were too. So the Zeta treaties came down in the early 1930s. Actually, they started in the 1920s. In the 1930s is when they began to make official treaties, where a group called MJ-12, or Majestic 12, was formed that had to do with certain members of the Illuminati in America and in several other countries. It became the foundation of what later became the CIA in America, but it's connected with a bunch of other groups. Now, most of the people in the CIA don't know anything about MJ-12. Even in the highest ranks of most of our government and our services on the outside, they really don't know, and they honestly think most of this is just made up stuff. They don't even realize there's ETs. Some of them do, but most of them don't. The ones who know that ETs have been here are literally on death oaths, where literally they have signed contracts before they get to see or know anything, that if they reveal this information, they will be killed, but not only them, their families will be hunted. And that's what keeps them quiet. They're quiet because they're afraid. And most of them didn't get in on it because they wanted to see ETs. They were usually in a level of service that had top security clearance to begin with. And certain things were going down, and one of their Illuminati bosses, because see, the Illuminati guys are positioned in very, very specific little places. You don't have Illuminati controlling any one government. They're just certain people put in the right places in power positions where they get to pull strings on the lower ranks below them. So the Illuminati people get kind of suckered into this stuff. They really do. People, when we look at our external governments, these guys have been messed with just like the rest of the humans here. Except the only difference was they had some knowledge something was going on, and they trusted the wrong groups. They got played because of their own greed. Because there was a greed factor that played right into the Zetas plan, where the Illuminati guys wanted power. They wanted dominion over territories here. They didn't know about Stargates. That was a new surprise, because they didn't remember from Atlantis either. But the Zetas come in and say, okay, this invasion is coming. We can stop this invasion. And then we can get you in any position of power you want. We'll give you this technology. We'll give you weapons technology. And they did. They gave them certain types of weapons technology. So in the 1930s, you had the Zeta Regalian treaties and Majestic 12, and what happened from that point on was a very rapid organization of something called the World Management Team. It was already a not quite as formalized organization of Illuminati covert governing, but it was more like tribes that were governing things from behind the scenes that were being motivated by the Anunnaki races. When the Dracs came in, the Zeta Regalians on behalf of the Dracs, they homogenized everything into, it was like the beginning of our corporate structure. They pulled it all together and did like time efficiency, got everybody really organized so they'd function well. They created the World Management Team, which later moved into like what they call it, the like World Banking Commission stuff and the multinational corporations. All of this stuff came out of the activities of the World Management Team, Bilderberg Commission, all of this stuff. This started, and we actually have the Zetas and the Dracs to thank for that. The Anunnaki hadn't quite got that far. They were still playing with religions and had their like nice Templar groups and various mystical societies, but they hadn't quite pulled the political organizations together. The Dracs did that through the Zetas when they came in. Now, also in the 1930s, once the Zetas got in here, they began to activate the old Falcon APIN system. That was the one that was connected to the Falcon matrix. And the Falcon literally spread its wings across the planet. So these were these little microchip-like implant grids that ran through the planet. What these grids do is they allow for communication, they allow for frequency transmission and broadcasting, but they also they can fire, which means they'll pop and create little black holes along the whole grid that would connect. See, these were put in with the purpose of, when the stellar activation cycle came, to activate and fire them all, which would create a whole series of little black holes, kind of like, how when a needle runs across a piece of fabric from like a sewing machine needle, it leaves all those little holes. Well, if you do enough of those holes, that whole piece will fall right into the phantom matrix. That's what they were created for. The ones that the Guardian races created were meant to work differently. They were meant to create pillars of sound that would anchor our grids into the grids of inner Earth, parallel Earth, and another time matrix called the Miage zone system, which is another one that interfaces here only sometimes, to give us pillars of energy that would allow us to not get pulled down into phantom. So they begin to activate. The Zetas begin to activate in the 1930s their Falcon APIN system. Also in the 30s, they begin to assist to more fully organize Hitler's Nazi movement. They had a vested interest. They could do some interesting things with the Hitler guys. Well, one of the first things they wanted to do was to get rid of certain races that were competing. I'm getting tired. The races they were most interested in getting rid of were a certain group that had been very loyal to the Anunnaki Illuminati, and that they wouldn't go into the Zeta contracts. And these guys were Hebrew. They were passed off as Hebrew, but they weren't Hebrew people. They were Hybiru. They were the Hybiru race lines. Now, hiding under the guise of Hebrew, you have real Hebrew people, which were angelic humans. You have Hyksos, false Hebrew people, which were one of the hybrid lines from the Anunnaki side. And you have Hybiru that has both Anunnaki and Drak family lines in it. What the Zetas wanted done was to get rid of a whole bunch of the Hybiru and the Hyksos lines of what appeared to be the Jewish population, but to leave the ones that were the draconian lines. And for a while, that was going on. As we moved through this period, we're going into World War and everything. I'll go down to here, because we have stuff to do in here that just blew my mind when I found out about what the whole Japanese thing was really about. Down here, but first we had in the 30s, the Zetas and the Drak agendas were assisting Hitler. Down here, by the time we kind of moved into the 40s, Hitler started to make double deals because the Necromaton and Dramies approached him. And they started to promise him that they would lead him to ancient relics, the Templar prizes. And they did. They showed him some stuff. They gave him some stuff, and that's still buried out there someplace. The Nazis actually had some of the ancient relics from Atlantis, because they used Necromaton and Dramies used them for barter to convince Hitler and his group to do some double dealing for them. And what the Andramis wanted was essentially getting rid of all these people. Why don't you get rid of those Drak families too, the ones that the Zetas wanted protected? So Hitler started to do that on behalf of the Andramis, because the Andromedes were paying them with some knowledge, mystical knowledge, and some of the relics from Atlantis. So this didn't settle really well with the Zetas. They got very upset, in fact. So they worked with the Allies to make sure Hitler was taken down. What was interesting before that, when the Draks were assisting Hitler, one of the ways they were assisting him was having the Illuminati in the Allied countries finance the Hitler movement. Literally, the United States Illuminati, the European Illuminati. While we're fighting these guys, the Illuminati guys are taking money from us and giving them to them to keep their movement going. So this is some of the sleight of hand that's been going on, with our politics. What was really bizarre was what happened with the whole, the Pearl Harbor leading to Hiroshima and all of that thing. What happened with this was at the points where in the 1930s the Zetas were expanding and activating their Falcon APIN system. Now this APIN system had some major sites that were more important than others, that had primary links that were stronger and larger than some of the smaller ones. One of the biggest ones and most important ones, if they were going to completely spread their, activate their matrix around the globe, was located in Nagasaki, Japan. Interestingly, not Hiroshima, Nagasaki. And because the Necromaton and Dramies were getting a little nervous at this point, because the Draks had come in, the Zetas on behalf of the Draks had come in, they'd literally gotten control of the Illuminati World Management Team, and they were starting to get control of the grids. And the Andramis didn't like that too much. It was becoming a nuisance and a problem. So the Necromaton were going to build bases. One of them was going to be beneath, in the waters around and beneath Nagasaki, so they could set up their own sonic system and block the Zetas from further activating the full Falcon grid. That didn't settle very well with the Zetas. The Necromaton were also going to put a base over in Hawaii, in the Hawaiian waters, and they were going to control certain networks on the Falcon through the ley line grids by having these bases here. They were going to stop the Falcon from fully spreading its wings. Well, that was the agenda the Necromaton had at the moment anyway. So what was done was a little interesting little deal where the Zeta groups approached their Illuminati races, because they had collectives here, they had collectives in Japan, they have them all over the place. It's not one nationality, has Zeta races and another has an Anunnaki. There are dominant ones, but really they're scattered throughout. So the Zetas approached both the Japanese Illuminati and the United States Illuminati. They told them what was going to go down. They told Japan to invade, to give us an excuse to go into the war. We knew, certain levels of our Illuminati knew that was coming. In fact, there were even messages sent when those fleets were coming in. They were spotted, they were seen by U.S. troops, and the information was sent back. But it was received, but it was never acknowledged having been received. So we got a surprise attack.
That's in the case of New York City.
What do you mean?
There were 9 messages.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I didn't even talk about that yet. So we have this situation, this drama created. The purpose of the drama was the Zetas, who were in power at the time for the Drac agenda, mobilized their Illuminati on both sides of the game to create a war game so they could, at one point, first of all, they stopped the Necromaton from building a base over in the Hawaiian area because there was so much scrutiny at that point and so much military presence in that point. They weren't going to be able to quietly build an underground base without getting spotted. So they weren't able to build the Necromaton weren't able to build their base off the coast of Hawaii. And that led to, after some other fancy dealings with other countries like Hitler and things like that, it led to, this was what they really wanted to do. The Necromaton had succeeded to some degree in sealing off the Nagasaki port interface that went with the Falcon Matrix. They didn't fully have a base there yet, but they'd started to build one, and they had what's like a frequency fence or cloaking shield. Now, if that cloaking shield was on there, the Zetas couldn't activate it. So they had to get something big enough and powerful enough, and they didn't have the grids fully activated yet to do the sonics the way they do now. If they were going to get that sonic power in the grids, they had to have all of these online. But if you drop a nuclear bomb on top of one of them, it tends to leave a weakness in those kind of fields that will allow mild sonics, which they did have access to shatter it. So they went after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima was very interesting. It had a whole little collective of Necromaton and Andrami Illuminati hybrid races, but the majority of the populations of Hiroshima were of the U-race descent. They were Magi Grail Line Indigos that were grid guardians, and they wanted to get rid of those and get rid of the competing Illuminati while they were at it. So they took out Hiroshima, but what they were really after was Nagasaki, because they needed to get that bomb dropped on those sites to weaken the force field that was over their port interface system, so they could then use the mild sonics they had available to completely flatten the force field so they could activate that site and get their supersonic waves available. What they've done by activating the full matrix of the Falcon, they were harnessing the power of being able to create targeted unnatural disasters, earthquakes. I mean, Alaska has been, since the 30s, and like moving especially up into the 40s, 50s, and 60s, this was like testing ground. They were using all sorts of sonics up there to see if they could target earthquakes, how far they could get. If you ever look at the information, like just that's on record as far as the earthquakes up in the Alaska area, there was Alaska. They went for certain desert areas. Then they started go for population areas when it became time to start reducing populations, because they knew that for the year 2000 to 2008, when their invasion was scheduled to go, if the stargates were going to open, which they didn't know until 1998, nobody was absolutely certain if the frequencies in the grids would be enough to actually trigger what's called grounding of the stellar bridge. That is when certain frequencies start to come down from the higher dimensional gates, and if there's a compatible frequency in Earth's core, they will latch together, and that's what starts the cycle, the stellar activation cycle. It wasn't until 1998 that anybody knew for sure if it was actually going to go into full stellar activation, but everybody had their troops in position by that time. So all through, literally, from the periods of time when World War II was orchestrated as a territorial conquest and competition between who was going to get what grids activated, it went into series of several types of testing. Now, still throughout this time, the Zetas, on behalf of the Draconian agenda, were doing population reduction experiments to see, okay, when it got closer to 2000, what would they use to really, take them out. And the idea was to take them out without getting the surface people all stirred up, because the last thing any of them wanted was for us to realize there was an invasion taking place, because there was enough of us to do something about it. And you had the Guardian groups trying like heck to try to get in here and communicate with any of us. If we started to realize from this level there was an invasion taking place, the Guardians might just get an in and somebody might listen if they could get through to them telepathically or something. So it was always had to be kept hush-hush, make sure the general populations don't know. Most of the military and governments don't know. Only head echelons in the Illuminati have had the privilege of knowing that we've had ETs here for 70 years. Okay? So it progressed from World War II drama. Let's see. In 1943, this was after like the war stuff had, begun to cool down. In 1943, there was something called the Philadelphia experiment was launched. All right, this was done on August 12th, 1943, and if you'll notice in a lot of things, August 12th comes up all the time. August 12th is an important time in relation to how frequency works in the planetary grids. It's called a magnetic peak point. What that means is the planetary magnetic Merkaba spins at its fastest during that time. I think it starts around the 8th of August. It hits its climax point at the 12th, and then is still at a peak until I think about the 15th. So there's usually activity. If they're going to do sonics or anything, they need to amplify them. These are the periods of time that they use. August 12th. Montauk was done August 12th. All right, there has been, August 12th all along has been a point in time when if there were going to be sonics used in the grids that had to have an extra kick behind them, that's when we do them. That's why the dimensional blend experiment of 2003 was scheduled for August 12th, 2003. That was supposed to be the last phase. First you had Philadelphia experiment. That did one thing. What the Philadelphia experiment did was it took the Falcon wormhole, which already had some of its APIN systems activated, and it blew open smaller wormholes in the Philadelphia area. These were areas that were already spiked. They were parts of the Falcon grid that had been put in Atlantis, but they were larger holes. They were wormholes that you could actually use. You could literally go from that wormhole directly into Phantom instead of having to go from the port interface site down back to the main wormhole and in. So these are like direct smaller holes that would lead in. They did the Philadelphia experiment, and what they did in the Philadelphia experiment is they got literally the whole East Coast lineup in. They activated all of those grids, which ran from Portland, Maine, all the way down through Boston, down through New York City. All of our major cities have been built along these lines. It wasn't an accident. They were built along these lines because concentrations of populations were needed there, because that's the areas where you need to run the frequency through the DNA templates to have the most effect. So they would set up, literally, the places where major civilizations were going to take place to make sure concentrations of bodies were going to be on those grids. All right, so by the time we did the 1943 experiment, this really gave them an extra, the Zetas an extra, they were really in control of things at this point, because they had control of most of the grids. The other matrices, the Falcon matrix and the other competing APIN systems, weren't activated yet. And the Anunnaki still had part of their advantage. They had the Nibiru and Datic crystal grid, and they had the net, but they were progressively losing control of the sites that they used to have everything under control through the net. They couldn't use that anymore because progressively the Zetas were, the Falcon matrix was getting control over the 24 crystal temple sites that I've talked about, the Nibiru crystal temple sites. They're getting control over the grids. So this was starting to create an issue. Now that the Dracs had come in on behalf, the Zeta Regalians on behalf of the Drac agenda, they had come in, and all of a sudden the Anunnaki realized they weren't getting as far as they wanted to as fast. They thought it would be an easy kill. They thought they'd come in here and just get rid of some, troublesome Illuminati groups that belonged to the Dracs and belonged to the Necromaton, and then they'd just, saunter in and take the place. It wasn't going to go that way because of what happened in the 30s and 40s. Now, in 1951, the Necromaton and Dramis begin to make deals with the Jehovian Anunnaki. Now usually Necromaton don't want to talk to anybody, and the Jehovians don't either, so they had something in common. They didn't like anybody else but themselves. So they decided to make a deal, because they're watching this happen. They're watching the Dracs take over, and they don't like the other Anunnaki groups, so they're thinking, you know, by the time we're supposed to activate our APIN systems, we're not going to be able to activate them. They're going to take them over. So there were deals made between the Necromaton Andramis and the Dove Matrix, which are the ones that were associated with the Enoch teachings before, the Jehovian bipedal dolphin people of Sirius A, Arcturus, and Trapezium Orion. All right. So the Necromaton Andramis had already gotten control. Like this happened right before. This happened in Atlantis, right before the fall of Atlantis. Our grid that was called the Golden Eagle APIN system